Charles Darwin was unavoidably racist. I mean, in the classic sense of racist. This is not meant merely as a pejorative, although it certainly is a pejorative. But I mean, he was a racist, a racialist who did not view the races as equal, and who saw the darker races as, according to his lights, unavoidably inferior to the lighter races. So that's Charles Darwin.
That is true.
We start there.
That is true. Now, scientific racism, actually, there were evolutionary thinkers before Darwin, and so there is a little bit of a longer story, but Darwin's theory was the one that really glommed on, so it's the most important. One more caveat, though, because people who are watching or who hear our conversation, a common refrain on the other side is, well, Darwin opposed slavery. Well, that's true. He did. His wife, who was a fairly devout Unitarian, not a Christian, came from a family that believed in the abolition of slavery. Of course, Darwin was writing decades after the work of William Wilberforce and others, so it was not fashionable to support slavery. So I'm not knocking that, but anyone who thinks that Darwin was, leading the charge for abolition, that's ridiculous. But he did oppose slavery. So he wasn't, on the categories of racist, there were people worse than Darwin. Having said that, his theory, he thought he had found scientific justification to explain why racism is true, basically. And that was tremendously influential on American scientists, and we'll unpack about it. But that idea was then, it was tremendously influential in a bad way.
Welcome to Socrates in the studio. We are in Seattle at the Rainier Club. Just last night, we had a Socrates in the City event with a wonderful crowd, with John West as my guest. And now we have a Socrates in the Studio event here in Seattle with John West, but no audience, at least no audience here. There is an audience out there. John West, welcome.
Thank you for having me again, a double header.
Yeah, we've done a few of these in Seattle now, and you're a lifelong Seattleite. Is that a word, or is it pronounced satellite?
Yeah, it's pronounced Seattleite, but technically I grew up outside of the big city, so I wouldn't consider myself a Seattle.
But you're from this neck of the woods.
I am, yeah.
Okay. I had never been to this neck of the woods. Before we get into the subject of our conversation, which is a documentary film called Human Zoos, which is at least fascinating. I just want to ask you about Seattle. So you did grow up in this neck of the woods. I'd never been here until, I guess, 26 years ago. My wife and I came for a visit. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law lived up in Bellingham, and I was struck by the number of coffee shops with clever names. They all had clever names, and can you think of a clever coffee shop name, or does it all just, you're so sick of it, you don't?
I'm sick of it. I actually hate to admit that I tend to drink tea, not coffee.
Yeah,
but I'm from
don't admit it publicly. But I came up at the time. I felt challenged to come up with a clever coffee shop name, and I think I came up with objectively the most clever coffee shop name. No one could top this, and it's in two parts, and I'd like to share them with you. You ready? Okay, coffee shop name, two parts. So I'll say the first one, I'll pause, then I'll say the second part. Okay, here it is. Bean me up, biscotti. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I don't think anybody can top that. I don't know. I really think that was it was a Rima word of knowledge. But we're here to talk about something that is so fascinating. But let me ask you to frame it. What is Human Zoos, the documentary, and what was your involvement in making Human Zoos, the documentary film?
Human Zoos tells the largely untold story that most people don't know about of the history of scientific racism, specifically in America, and a particular part of it where we would put indigenous peoples from Africa, from Asia, South America on public display so that people could gawk at them, often sometimes behind fences, and in fact, in at least one dramatic case, in a zoo, in a cage. And often they were offered as lower stages of evolutions or missing links between humans and apes. And that's how they were portrayed by scientists.
Yeah, this is before the Darwinian evolutionists realized that racism was bad. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so when did the film come out, and where did it come out?
Yeah, so the first cuts of it came out at the end of 2018, and it was shown at some film festivals. Then it was shown in some place in 2019. It got on the large Catholic network EWTN, on I think the NRB network. It was screened actually in the world's largest African American History Museum in Detroit, among other places. And then in 2019, 2020, it got on YouTube finally, after it had been screened on cable and in live audiences.
And what was your role in making the film?
I was chief bottle washer, and I basically wrote it and directed it. So other than the people that we hired to actually film it and do
Wait a minute. So yes, you are the writer and director of the film.
It was a pretty low budget.
You're allowed to admit that, because it's true. You're the writer. You wrote it.
I did.
And directed it, which is what I thought. So the full title is Human Zoos, or is there a subtitle?
I think there is a subtitle. So, but the main thing is Human Zoos, but it's about untold history of scientific racism or something. But
right.
that was added because also on DVD and Blu-ray, even though very few people do those things anymore.
Yeah.
So we added a subtitle for that. But the main thing is Human Zoos.
Human Zoos. Okay, so this is a documentary film that you were the principal architect of it.
Yep.
And when it went on YouTube, is it still available on YouTube?
It is.
Okay. How many people roughly have seen it by now?
About 4.4 million. And all of that is pretty much organic promotion from YouTube. We did virtually no advertising on it. And it's kind of interesting because you might think, so 2020, it was on YouTube for about a year, got maybe 100,000 views, which isn't bad. But then around February, March, so this is before George Floyd, this is before a lot of the other things that happened that year, YouTube, for some reason known only to its algorithms, began to push it like millions of times. And I still don't know to this day why they did that. And they kept pushing it and kept pushing it. And then it sort of went down. And then
This is an example of the normally nefarious YouTube being less than nefarious. It's a wonderful thing because what you talk about in the film, and obviously I want to get into that, it's just undeniably shocking. It's just shocking. It's fascinating because it's part of a history that has been, no pun intended, whitewashed. We basically said we don't want to talk about that. That's embarrassing. It is more than embarrassing. It's horrifying. It is a very black mark in the story of science. Let's be honest. And I think that part of what Discovery Institute, where you're a senior fellow, has been just doing an inestimable service, is in pointing out the limits of science, when science and where science has gone dramatically wrong, as a warning to us, like, be careful. Science is human beings, and human beings can get it wrong. And the story of Human Zoos it's the classic case.
This is what made it controversial because, people know that there's a history of racism in America, but we've kind of glossed over, and certainly the scientists have glossed over, the role that science played. And it wasn't just a marginal role that they were culturally racist already. I'm sure some of that was true, but there was a really tight connection between the scientific claims being made and the racist claims being made. So this wasn't just tangential that you had.
Well, I want to unpack that because it's key. In other words, it's not just, they were racist. Their racism followed logically, inevitably, from their scientific views. It's not that you have scientists who happen to be racist. You have scientists whose scientific views are unavoidably racist, and that's what you deal with in the film.
Yeah, and that it provided this scientific justification that actually further pushed racism.
Of course. So I want to talk about that, but before we talk about that, I want to find out or ask you how you came to make the film, what preceded this? What got you interested in making a film about the subject?
So I had a long-term interest. I wrote a book a number of years ago called Darwin Day in America that was sort of a history of social Darwinism in America. And so the scientific racism was a small part of that book. And so I've been interested in how the abuse of science has led to things that we really should be questioning. And that's one reason we should have an open debate over scientific claims, is because when you don't, bad things happen. And so I've had a long-term interest. I had a friend, another filmmaker actually, who told me about this case, which we can get into later, the most shocking case at a New York zoo, the Bronx Zoo, where someone actually was put in a cage.
A human being.
Yes, a human being, in the monkey house and put on display. And his name was Ota Benga, and we can go into that. And he had been planning to do a documentary on that, but could never get it off the ground. So I knew about it in the back of my mind from my friend. And then years later, I had the chance to we had some donors and things who were interested in exploring the impact of social Darwinism. And so I thought, well, this would be a good time to delve into this some more and to maybe even do a documentary on it.
Okay, I think I wasn't going to start here, but it seems to me, and I've talked about this because I wrote my book, Is Atheism Dead? I speak about these things publicly, and it's come to my attention. It's just unavoidable that strict Darwinism is unavoidably, inescapably racist, because the thesis is that there's no such thing as we're made in the image of God, we're all equal in the image of God. In other words, the biblical account says that every race of humanity is equal in the eyes of God and is equal, period. We're all made in God's image, period, case closed, we're human beings. But if you don't believe in the biblical version, if you believe in Darwinian evolution, you would say, well, no, there's a continuum, and on that continuum, some races are unavoidably more evolved than others.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have scientific, quote unquote, reasons to believe that some races are superior to other races and that some races are closer to apes than other races. I mean, that is an unbelievably damning thing to say, to conclude, to accept. So when you made the film Human Zoos, what you're doing is you're kind of looking back to the time before the scientific establishment and the Darwinists realized, like, this is not going to look good for us. That they were still thinking this is just what is, this is what's true, and they didn't have any compunction about being openly racist.
That's true. I want to say one thing. I mean, I'm not claiming that Darwinism is the only font of racism. Even though I completely agree with you that the Bible is very clear on human equality, sadly, there have been many Christians, even apart from science, who tried to claim that races were separately created and that God, they twisted the Bible and did not follow it. And so there are other founts of racism. Nonetheless, this scientific gloss on racism, I think, was really critical in pushing for some very vile things. And your point is right. In Darwin's view, human beings are not the epitome of something that God. We're not his masterwork, planned beforehand by God. We're the accidental product of this blind process of survival of the fittest. Now, when you get down to the brass tacks, this is how it works out. Darwin pointed out that natural selection, or survival of the fittest, works differently on different human populations because you have the accidental variations, but then it's your environment that determines what helps you survive. And so Darwin was very explicit in his book, The Descent of Man, which is one of his follow-up books on the origin of species, where he said, we have good reasons to believe that natural selection is going to act differently on different varieties of humans. And so as he put it explicitly in that book, we should expect races should have significantly different capacities in all sorts of things, including mental capacities, because natural selection isn't going to operate the same way on every human group. Because if you're, in a hunter-gatherer society in and need to do other things for survival in, say, a niche in Africa, the things that natural selection is going to program for you is different than if you're in Iceland or something else. Now, if you have the Christian view, it doesn't really matter because underlying the same human race was created by God for the same reason. So, you should expect equality. But in a Darwinian view, Darwin was very explicit on this. You should expect dramatic differences. And that's what he actually said in The Descent of Man.
But, well, I guess the distinction I want to make, though, is that the biblical account says you are either a human being or you are not, period, case closed.
Yes.
The Darwinian view says there is no such thing actually as a human being. We are all in process, and therefore some human beings will be more closely allied to apes and monkeys than other human beings, so that there really is no such thing as there's maybe the Darwinians would say this group is more evolved than others, but they don't even make a distinction. So it seems to me, and where we're going to go, to get back to the film Human Zoos, but that the assertion really is that some of these people that we would say are people, they would say, well, they're not quite people. They're subhuman. Maybe they're not apes, but they are on the continuum between apes and the northern white races.
That's very true. But the additional point, I'll come back to that, but the additional point I just wanted to stress is that even if you don't follow that continuum, in Darwin's view, all of our capacities are due to these blind chance variations acted on by survival of the fittest. And so if you have all sorts of different human groups, natural selection is invariably going to act differently on those groups and give them different traits. And that's why Darwin thought it was perfectly logical. In fact, that was what his theory predicted, that you would have different races of humans who had dramatically different capabilities. His theory predicts that. But you were right that in the meta story is we started out subhuman, and then so we gradually evolved. And so then, different varieties of humans, where do they fit in that story? And Darwin was also very clear on that. In The Descent of Man, he talks about how, in his view, the break basically between apes and humans, where did that come? It was with blacks, Aborigines in Australia, blacks, and African blacks, that they were the closest humans to apes. In Darwin's view, he very explicit, and his followers were even more on that. So he had a friend, scientist, one of the most noted Darwinian scientists in Germany, Ernst Haeckel. They corresponded a lot. Ernst Haeckel was known for a lot of things. He fraudulently created some embryo diagrams that were false, but he also had a diagram that appeared in countless textbooks of human evolution, and you start with these ape-like creatures, and then you end up with these Teutonic males, and in the middle, where's the break? It's an African-looking creature and then the first human. And Haeckel's point there was that the gap between the highest Teutonic male and the lowest human was larger than the gap between the lowest human and the highest ape.
Okay, one headline from what you just said strikes me that Charles Darwin was unavoidably racist. I mean, in the classic sense of racist. This is not meant merely as a pejorative, although it certainly is a pejorative, but I mean, he was a racist, a racialist who did not view the races as equal, and who saw the darker races as, according to his lights, unavoidably inferior to the lighter races. So that's Charles Darwin.
That is true.
We start there.
That is true. Now, scientific racism, actually, there were evolutionary thinkers before Darwin, and so there is a little bit of a longer story, but Darwin's theory was the one that really glommed on, so it's the most important. One more caveat, though, because people who are watching or who hear our conversation, a common refrain on the other side is, well, Darwin opposed slavery. Well, that's true. He did. His wife, who was a fairly devout Unitarian, not a Christian, came from a family that believed in the abolition of slavery. Of course, Darwin was writing decades after the work of William Wilberforce and others, so it was not fashionable to support slavery. So I'm not knocking that, but anyone who thinks that Darwin was leading the charge for abolition, that's ridiculous. He was but he did oppose slavery. So he wasn't, on the categories of racist, there were people worse than Darwin. Having said that, his theory, he thought he had found scientific justification to explain why racism is true, basically. And that was tremendously influential on American scientists, and we'll unpack about it. But that idea was then, it was tremendously influential in a bad way.
Well, I mean, it's just fascinating to me because at my alma mater, Yale University, they changed the name of my residential college. It was John C. Calhoun College, and they changed it because Calhoun was a racist. But he was only a racist the way everyone around him was a racist. He didn't have a unique theory supporting racism. In other words, if you're going to tear down a statue of John Calhoun, it seems to me that tearing down a statue of Charles Darwin would have to precede that. But Darwin somehow, because he has this stature among enlightened progressives, he escapes that. But it's interesting to me just to look at it as we're looking at it now. What you just said about, to get back to the film Human Zoos, the human beings that were put in the zoos were always black human beings, right? They didn't say, well, here's a Norwegian, they basically,
they were non-white,
making their case that there's a continuum, that there's evolution. We're showing you evolution, and here is an example of something that is not quite on the level of we white people who have put him in the zoo. So it's disturbing, and what makes it further disturbing to me is that other than this film Human Zoos, it's pretty much wiped away. We don't talk about it, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, because I said this is a big piece of our scientific history.
Yeah. So just to be clear, just to clarify, to make sure that people know, they didn't call them human zoos at the time, and many of these were displays at world fairs or other things where they brought in indigenous people, and some of it was, well, let's understand their culture. But actually, if you actually look at how they were portrayed, like at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, where they brought in thousands of people, not just blacks, but people from Asia, from South America, they set them up in these villages, sometimes behind fences where people could sort of poke at them, and they advocated and described them in many cases, both from Africa and actually from the Philippines, that they were evolutionary missing links.
And wait a minute. At the 1904 World's Fair
in St. Louis.
In St. Louis.
Yes.
So the World's Fair is not a zoo.
Yeah.
These are not cages. These are displays. But in 1904 at the World's Fair, these human beings are described as missing links. In other words, as not human beings, but as transitional forms between apes and human beings.
They imported thousands of people, so from Asia, Africa, South America, put them in these villages, put fences around them so you could sort of look in, and then newspaper stories and things put by anthropologists.
Wearing your hoop skirt, carrying your parasol. Not that we would wear hoop skirts, but the point is that
there are pictures actually of people doing that.
Early Edwardian people would go to visit these enclosures. I mean, it's horrifying. But the fact that you're saying that they were actually labeled as links.
At least some of them were, and it gets even worse. So as part of this, they brought in scientists to study these people. So in the deep bowels of one of the fair buildings, they would do testing, not just IQ testing, but testing for pain and other things of these people to try to determine, just how much lower were they than whites. It was even worse than that. There was a anthropologist at the Smithsonian, Els Herlichka, who his career was gathering brains from people so that he could show higher and lower evolved people. And so he went to the fair hoping that some of the people would die there so that he could then harvest their brains, which they did. And he actually, even now, actually just within the last year, this has been a scandal that the Washington Post finally wrote about, because he had a collection of hundreds of brains, often got not with really permission of people, to try to show that they were, evolutionary backward. And he stored they're still stored in a facility, non-public facility in the Smithsonian, in these vats. And so, I mean, there's a deep history here. Not just the displays were the public part of it, but the way that they, engaged in testing on people, the way they harvested brains to try to, and then put some of those brains on display.
Because of my Bonhoeffer book, I'm aware of the Nazi doctors
Yes.
having precisely this disturbing view and behaving toward Jews and others whom they considered inferior in precisely this horrifying way. I mean, I want to leap to Ota Benga because that is the classic case.
Yes.
And it's in the film Human Zoos. But tell the story of Ota
Benga. So Ota Benga was Congolese. At the time, he would be called a pygmy because he was short. Today, we don't really use that language as much. But so he was a young man from Africa who he was brought along with other Africans first for the 1904 World's Fair to be put on display. Then he was allowed to go back to Africa, but then he was brought back by a guy named Samuel Werner, who was a one-time Presbyterian pastor, but by this time he was sort of a scientist. He was hunting people for to put on display first in the World's Fair. Then he brought him back to New York City, and he, with other specimens, he brought in chimpanzees, other things, because he would try to sell things to museums. I mean, he sort of considered Ota Benga, considered him his friend, and so it's a really strange relationship. But the bottom line is that Samuel Werner, who brought him back, didn't know what to do with him, and so basically made a financial arrangement. I won't say sold him, but made a financial arrangement with the Bronx Zoo, which was run by people like at Columbia University, Henry Fairfield Osborn, one of the nation's top paleontologists. He was also involved with the Bronx Zoo, to put Ota Benga on display with a monkey in the monkey house in a cage.
What year was this?
1906, September.
Okay, so this is the classic case. I mean, you make the case in Human Zoos a little bit more obliquely, but this is not at all oblique. This is putting a human being, a dark-skinned human being from Africa, in a cage with a monkey, with an animal. In the monkey house, not just in a cage. It was in the primate house for monkeys. So that is as horrifying a thing to talk about as anything. You talk about the dehumanization of a human being. You talk about the objectification of your fellow man, and this is the classic case. So this is 1906. Ota Benga, a Congolese man, treated in this way. What happened to Ota Benga?
So over 200,000 people flocked to this exhibit. It was the toast of the town, the toast of places like, and we should talk about the New York Times role in promoting this. He was, on some of the days, he was actually, when he was let out of the cage, he was actually, people chased him down. I mean, people were not nice to him, so it was a pretty awful thing. Now, there were a few people who stood up against it. The first was a white Baptist minister, a Reverend Stuart MacArthur, and he said, "This is wrong. This is demeaning someone, and by even doing it, you're demeaning yourself by demeaning him." And then, and I want to point that out because it was a white minister. He knew that it was wrong. But then there were a number of black clergy, and particularly James Gordon, who was part of an orphanage, and who stood up. And James Gordon made the point that we blacks are human beings just like whites, and that neither whites or blacks came from the lower animals, and that this is promoting this Darwinian view that degrades all human beings. And he made a very eloquent argument against this, and that blacks are people who have souls just like whites. What's very interesting is how the intelligentsia of the time in New York City reacted, the secular intelligentsia, particularly the New York Times. And we actually I quote in the, people can hear what the New York Times actually said. The New York Times basically sniffed its nose and actually attacked James Gordon for, how dare you, everyone accepts Darwin's theory now, it's like the multiplication table, or like, adding or subtraction. And so that our reverend colored brother who says that, they basically sneered at him, and that, Ota Benga probably, enjoyed it. He's fine. And it's just, the New York Times went out of its way to demean Ota Benga, has never apologized for this. The New York Times has written about this and about the Bronx Zoo and what they did, but the New York Times, to my knowledge, has never apologized for its own role in defending what went on and sneering at Ota Benga and sneering at the black ministers who, based on their Christian beliefs of human equality, were criticizing this.
Yeah, I mean, you have to draw a clear distinction. Many people are uncomfortable in doing so, but between a biblical view of human beings and a quote-unquote scientific Darwinist view of human beings. The Darwinist view of human beings, it follows logically that if we evolved, that there is a continuum that follows logically. But it seems that the scientific establishment today has distanced itself, but without giving reasons for distancing itself. In other words, you have to say, why is that racist view wrong? We, as Christians, would say, we know why that view is wrong. But if you're a Darwinist, why is racism wrong? And it seems to me that they don't really know why it's wrong, and therefore I have to ask, do they actually know that it is wrong? Because, what you've just said, all of the mandarins, the scientific mandarins of 1906 sneered at the other point of view. They said, this is science. This is science. Follow the science. Science says this. If you have a problem with it, that's your problem. This is what science says. And we know that view worked its way through the early part of the 20th century right into the death camps. Like, we know that. And so what could a scientist today, a strict Darwinist, plausibly say as to why suddenly now racism is considered wrong? How do they do that?
Well, it's a combination, but let me say that even after the death camps, even certainly the Holocaust was a wake-up call.